Get out of my seat. You don't belong here." The word sliced through the first-class cabin like a blade, turning every head toward the source of the venom. What followed would destroy one life, transform another, and prove that sometimes justice comes from 30,000 feet above the clouds. The December wind howled across JFK's Terminal 4, rattling the floor-to-ceiling windows and turning the runway lights into blurred streaks of amber against the darkness. Inside the Delta Sky Club, the air hung thick with the scent of fresh coffee and expensive cologne, a sharp contrast to the bitter cold seeping through the glass. Jerome Washington sat hunched in the corner, his weathered leather messenger bag clutched between his knees like a shield against the world. 23 years old and feeling every minute of it, Jerome stared at his boarding pass for what had to be the 15th time in the last hour. First-class seat, 1A. The letters seemed to mock him, printed on paper that felt too crisp, too official, for someone wearing his father's old brown leather jacket and shoes he'd resoled twice. He was supposed to be celebrating right now, supposed to be riding the high of winning the Innovation Tomorrow engineering competition, but all he felt was the familiar weight of not belonging. The competition had been everything to him: months of sleepless nights in MIT's engineering lab, designing a water purification system that could bring clean drinking water to rural communities for less than $50 per household. When he'd submitted his prototype, he hadn't dared to hope, hadn't let himself imagine what winning might mean. But then the call came, the voice on the other end telling him he'd not only won, but had earned the grand prize, $75,000, a full scholarship renewal, and a first-class ticket to the International Engineering Symposium in Geneva. His grandmother's voice echoed in his memory from their phone call that morning, her pride crackling through the static of their old landline back in Millerville, Alabama. "Lord Jerome, your mama and daddy would be so proud of you, baby. You're living the dream they never got to see." The familiar ache hit his chest, the one that came whenever someone mentioned his parents killed by a drunk driver when he was 17, just as he was starting to believe college might actually be possible. The lounge around him buzzed with the confident conversations of frequent flyers people who spoke casually about quarterly earnings and weekend homes in the Hamptons. Jerome pulled his advanced thermodynamics textbook from his bag, hoping the familiar equations might calm his nerves. But the words blurred together on the page. He'd been questioned 3 times getting through security, his passport examined under bright lights, as if it might be counterfeit. His scholarship documentation scrutinized by agents who seemed surprised that someone who looked like him could have legitimate business in first class. Boarding for Flight 447 to Geneva will begin shortly. The gate agent announced, her voice cutting through the ambient noise. Jerome's stomach clenched as he gathered his belongings, checking one more time that his scholarship letter was safely tucked in his jacket pocket. He'd learned early that documentation was armor, that having the right papers could mean the difference between respect and suspicion, between being seen as a student or being seen as a threat. As he walked toward Gate B32, weaving through the sea of travelers, Jerome couldn't shake the feeling that eyes were following him. A security guard's gaze lingered, a beat too long. A woman in an expensive coat looked him up and down with barely concealed distaste. He kept his head up, his grandmother's voice in his ear. "Walk with purpose, baby. You earned your place in this world, don't you forget it." The jet bridge stretched before him like a tunnel into another universe, one where someone like him might actually belong among the leather seats and crystal glasses. Jerome handed his boarding pass to the smiling flight attendant, a woman whose name tag read Maria, and felt a spark of hope when she welcomed him warmly without the suspicion he'd grown accustomed to. The first-class cabin of the Airbus A330 felt like stepping into another world entirely, one that smelled of fresh orchids and expensive leather, where every surface gleamed with polished wood and brushed metal. Jerome found himself moving carefully, as if his worn shoes might somehow damage the plush carpet beneath them. Seat 1. A sat by the window, a private pod that probably cost more than his grandmother made in 3 months cleaning houses. He slid into the seat and immediately felt swallowed by luxury, the leather so soft it seemed to embrace him. For a moment he allowed himself to enjoy it, to run his fingers along the smooth armrest and marvel at the personal entertainment screen that was larger than the television back home. His battered laptop bag looked jarringly out of place against the pristine surfaces, a reminder of the gap between this world and the one he came from. Jerome pulled out his thermodynamics textbook and opened it to Chapter 12, hoping to lose himself in the familiar comfort of equations and principles that made sense unlike the social dynamics he was navigating. Around him, other passengers settled into their pods with the casual confidence of people who belonged here, who'd never had to question whether they deserved the space they occupied. The flight attendant, Maria, appeared beside his seat with a warm smile that seemed genuine rather than professional. "Can I get you anything to drink before we take off, Mr. Washington?" she asked, using his name as if he mattered, as if he belonged. Jerome asked for water, and she returned with a crystal glass and a small plate of warm nuts, treating him with the same courtesy he observed her showing the other passengers. He was just beginning to relax, to believe that maybe this flight would pass without incident, when the atmosphere in the cabin shifted like a sudden drop in air pressure. The conversations around him quieted, and Jerome felt that familiar prickle on the back of his neck that told him something was wrong, though he couldn't yet see what it was. The boarding continued around him, a steady stream of business travelers and wealthy tourists claiming their seats with practiced ease. Jerome kept his eyes on his textbook, but his attention was pulled toward the entrance of the cabin where he could hear the sharp click of expensive heels and a voice that carried the unmistakable tone of someone accustomed to being obeyed. He didn't look up yet, didn't want to draw attention to himself, but he could feel the energy in the cabin changing, becoming tenser somehow. Other passengers were taking notice too, conversations pausing mid-sentence as everyone's attention was drawn toward whatever was happening at the front of the cabin. Jerome's hand unconsciously went to the small cross necklace his grandmother had given him before he left for MYT, her father's cross that had carried 3 generations of their family through hard times. "When you feel lost, baby, remember who you are and where you come from," she'd told him. Right now, surrounded by more luxury than he'd ever imagined, Jerome needed that reminder more than ever. The feeling of being watched intensified, and Jerome finally allowed himself to glance up from his textbook. That's when he saw her for the first time, a woman in an expensive camel-colored coat, her platinum blonde hair arranged in a perfect chignon, her face set in an expression of cold appraisal as she surveyed the cabin like a queen inspecting her domain. And her eyes, sharp and calculating, had landed directly on him. Victoria Ashford swept into the first-class cabin like a winter storm, bringing with her an aura of entitlement that seemed to chill the air around her. At 58, she was a woman who had never heard the word no applied to herself, whose platinum blonde hair was lacquered into submission and whose every movement spoke of someone who believed the world existed to serve her desires. The camel hair coat draped across her shoulders probably cost more than most people made in a year, and she wore it like armor against a world she found increasingly disappointing. Behind her struggled Ashley, her 26-year-old personal assistant juggling shopping bags from Hermes, Gucci, and Cartier while trying to keep pace with Victoria's aggressive stride. Ashley's face was flushed with the effort and embarrassment of being verbally abused in public, a daily occurrence when working for a woman who viewed service workers as barely human. "Careful with that bag, you incompetent girl," Victoria snapped without bothering to lower her voice, causing several passengers to look up in alarm. "That ceramic piece is worth more than your pathetic salary, and if you damage it, I'll be deducting the replacement cost from whatever severance you manage to negotiate." Ashley's hands trembled as she adjusted her grip on the bags, her eyes fixed firmly on the floor to avoid the stares of other passengers. Victoria had inherited her late husband Harrison's pharmaceutical empire 3 years earlier, along with his real estate portfolio and investment holdings that made her one of the wealthiest women in Manhattan. But wealth without purpose had curdled into bitterness, and she spent her days finding new ways to assert her superiority over anyone unfortunate enough to cross her path. Maria, the flight attendant, approached with the kind of practiced smile that came from years of dealing with difficult passengers. "Welcome aboard, Mrs. Ashford," she said warmly. "May I help you with your coat?" But Victoria ignored her completely. Her attention focused on something that had clearly displeased her, her eyes scanning the cabin like a predator, looking for weakness. That's when she saw Jerome, the young black man in seat 1, reading what appeared to be a textbook, wearing clothes that, while clean and pressed clearly, didn't come from the kinds of stores Victoria frequented. Her eyes narrowed as she took in every detail: the worn leather messenger bag, the re-soled shoes, the jacket that had seen better days. This was not the kind of person she expected to find in first class, not the kind of person who belonged in her world. Victoria stopped dead in the aisle, her expensive heels clicking once more against the cabin floor before falling silent. She didn't move toward her assigned seat in 1B. Instead, she stood there blocking the flow of passengers behind her, her gaze fixed on Jerome with an expression that could have frozen fire. Around her, the conversations of other passengers began to falter as they noticed her behavior phones being discreetly pulled from pockets as people sensed that something dramatic was about to unfold. "Excuse me," Victoria said, her voice carrying that particular tone of authority that wealthy white women had perfected over generations, a sound that demanded immediate attention and compliance. But she wasn't addressing Jerome directly. Instead, she looked toward Maria with the kind of conspiratorial expression that assumed shared understanding. Jerome felt the weight of her stare and slowly looked up from his textbook, his stomach dropping as he took in her expression. He'd seen that look before in department stores, where he'd been followed by security in restaurants where hostesses had claimed to be fully booked while seating other customers in academic conferences where colleagues had assumed he was catering staff rather than a presenter. It was a look that said he didn't belong, that his presence was somehow offensive, that his very existence was a mistake that needed to be corrected. Maria approached Victoria with professional courtesy, though Jerome could see the tension in her shoulders. "Is there something I can help you with, Mrs. Ashford?" she asked, maintaining her friendly tone despite the growing sense that this situation was about to explode. Victoria's lips curved into what might have been a smile on someone else's face, but looked more like a predatory showing of teeth. "Yes, there most certainly is a problem," she said, her voice rising just enough to ensure that other passengers could hear her clearly. "I believe there's been some sort of mistake with the seating arrangements." She gestured toward Jerome, as if he were an inanimate object rather than a human being. "That person appears to be in first class." The cabin fell silent except for the ambient hum of the aircraft's systems. Jerome's hands tightened on his textbook as every eye in the section turned toward him, and he felt the familiar burn of shame rising up his neck. This was it, the moment he'd been dreading since he'd first seen his boarding pass, the moment when his presence would be challenged and found wanting. But this time was different. This time he had every right to be there. The silence that followed Victoria's words felt dense enough to touch pressing down on Jerome's shoulders like a physical weight. Around the cabin, passengers had stopped pretending not to watch their conversations dying mid-sentence as they turned to witness what was clearly about to become a confrontation. Jerome's heart hammered against his ribs, that familiar cocktail of humiliation and anger flooding his system as he realized that his worst fears were about to be realized. "I'm sorry, ma'am," Jerome said, his voice steady despite the tremor he felt in his chest, "but I believe I'm in the correct seat." He reached into his jacket pocket with hands that he willed not to shake, pulling out the manila folder that contained his boarding pass, his identification, his scholarship documentation, and the letter from the Innovation Tomorrow Committee. Everything was organized with the kind of careful precision that came from years of having to prove he belonged in spaces where his presence was questioned. Victoria's eyes widened slightly at his response, as if she hadn't expected him to speak at all, much less to challenge her assumption. "Don't be ridiculous," she said, her voice taking on that particular edge that wealthy white women used when their authority was questioned. She looked at Maria as if Jerome's words were irrelevant, as if he were a child who didn't understand the adult conversation happening around him. Clearly, there's been some sort of mix-up with the reservations, and this young man has found himself in the wrong section of the aircraft. Maria stepped forward, her professional training kicking in as she tried to de-escalate what was obviously becoming a volatile situation. "Mrs. Ashford, I personally verified Mr. Washington's boarding pass when he entered the aircraft," she said calmly. "He is absolutely in his correct seat. Seat 1. A was assigned to him by our reservation system, and his documentation is completely in order." But Victoria wasn't interested in facts or documentation. She had made her assessment based on what she saw a young black man in clothes that didn't meet her standards sitting in a space she considered her domain. "I find that very hard to believe," she said, her voice growing louder now, carrying clearly to the economy passengers who were still boarding and slowing down to gawk at the scene unfolding in first class. Jerome spread his papers across his tray table like evidence in a trial, his movements deliberate and calm despite the chaos raging in his chest. "Here's my boarding pass," he said, pointing to the relevant information. "First class seat, 1A. Here's my government-issued ID, my scholarship letter from MIT, and the documentation from the Innovation Tomorrow competition that provided this upgrade." Victoria barely glanced at the papers before dismissing them with a wave of her hand. "Those could be forged," she said, and Jerome felt his jaw clench at the implication. "I know what first-class passengers look like, and you certainly don't fit the profile." The words hung in the air like a slap, their meaning crystal clear to everyone within earshot. Around them, Jerome could sense the shift in the cabin's energy. Some passengers were pulling out their phones, recognizing that they were witnessing something significant, something that needed to be documented. Others looked uncomfortable, shifting in their seats as if they wished they could disappear, rather than be forced to witness this public humiliation. "Ma'am," Maria said, her voice taking on a firmer tone, "I need to ask you to take your seat so we can complete the boarding process. Mr. Washington has provided all the necessary documentation, and there is absolutely no reason to question his right to be here." But Victoria was beyond reasoning. Now her face flushed with the kind of indignation that came from having her worldview challenged. "I refuse to sit next to someone who clearly doesn't belong here," Victoria declared, her voice rising to a level that ensured every passenger on the aircraft could hear her. "I paid $12,000 for this ticket, and I expect a certain level of comfort and security. I don't feel safe sitting next to someone who looks like—" She paused, clearly searching for words that would express her prejudice without crossing the line into obvious racism. "Someone who appears to be out of place in this environment." Jerome felt the familiar burn of shame and anger mixing in his stomach, that toxic combination that had plagued him since childhood, whenever his right to exist in certain spaces was questioned. But underneath the hurt, something else was stirring, a quiet determination that had carried him through MIT's rigorous program, through the death of his parents, through every moment when the world had tried to tell him he wasn't good enough. "Mrs. Ashford," he said, his voice carrying farther than he'd intended, reaching passengers throughout the cabin. "I understand that my presence makes you uncomfortable, but I've earned the right to be here through my academic achievements and my scholarship. I'm not asking for anything. I haven't worked for, and I'm not going to apologize for existing in a space where I belong." The words seemed to hit Victoria like a physical blow, her face contorting with rage at being spoken to so directly by someone she clearly considered beneath her station. "How dare you speak to me like that?" she snarled, taking a step closer to Jerome's seat. "I know people. I know the CEO of this airline. I will have you removed from this aircraft and banned from flying with this carrier ever again." But something had shifted in the cabin, and Jerome could feel it like a change in air pressure before a storm. The other passengers weren't just watching anymore. They were choosing sides, and the tide was beginning to turn. Dr. Rebecca Chen had been looking forward to the quiet of first class after 3 exhausting days at the International Pediatric Surgery Conference in Boston. As a Korean-American surgeon who had spent her career fighting for recognition in rooms where she was often the only woman and the only person of color, she recognized the sound of discrimination the moment it began to unfold 3 rows ahead of her. She'd heard that particular tone before the way certain people spoke when they believed their prejudices were shared by everyone around them. Pulling out her phone, Dr. Chen made a decision that would change everything. She opened her Twitter account, which had 43,000 followers thanks to her advocacy work for diversity in medicine, and began typing, "Watching blatant racism unfold on at Delta Flight 447. Young black MIT student being harassed by entitled white woman who doesn't think he belongs in first class. This needs to be documented." She hit the live stream button just as Victoria's voice rose to a volume that left no doubt about what was happening. Victoria had moved past coded language, now her mask slipping as her frustration mounted. "I don't care what papers he has," she declared, gesturing wildly toward Jerome. "Anyone can fake documentation these days. Look at him. Does he look like someone who can afford a $12,000 ticket? Does he look like he belongs in first class?" The words echoed through the cabin with crystal clarity captured perfectly by Dr. Chen's phone camera. On the live stream, comments began flooding in immediately. "Holy shit, is this real? Someone get this woman's name. That poor kid. This is why I don't fly." The viewer count climbed rapidly as people shared the link, the hashtag. First class racism beginning to trend within minutes of Dr. Chen hitting publish. Jerome sat perfectly still, his hands folded in his lap, his face a mask of dignity despite the humiliation burning in his chest. He'd been taught by his grandmother never to give people the reaction they wanted, never to let them see him break, but inside he was drowning. Every eye in the cabin was on him now, passengers in economy slowing their boarding to crane their necks and see what was happening. Flight attendants from other sections clustering near the galley to witness the scene. Sir Victoria said, finally addressing Jerome directly, but using a tone she might reserve for a disobedient child. "I'm going to give you one opportunity to gather your things and move to your appropriate seat in the back of the aircraft. If you do this quietly, there won't be any trouble. But if you insist on staying where you don't belong, I will have security remove you, and trust me, that won't be pleasant for anyone involved." The threat hung in the air like smoke from a fire that was just beginning to catch. Dr. Chen adjusted her angle to capture Jerome's response, her medical training helping her recognize the signs of someone fighting to maintain composure under extreme stress. His breathing was carefully controlled, his shoulders set in a way that spoke of military posture, his eyes fixed on a point somewhere beyond Victoria as if looking directly at her might break his resolve. "Ma'am Jerome," said his voice carrying a quiet strength that seemed to surprise Victoria, "I've shown you my documentation. I've answered your questions politely. I've done nothing to threaten you or anyone else on this aircraft. I'm simply sitting in the seat that was assigned to me trying to read my textbook and mind my own business. I don't understand why that's a problem for you, but I'm not moving." Victoria's face flushed a deeper shade of red, her carefully applied makeup beginning to crack around the edges as her anger mounted. "You don't understand," she repeated, her voice rising to near shriek levels. "I'll tell you what the problem is. The problem is that I paid first-class prices to avoid exactly this kind of situation. I paid for a certain level of safety and comfort, and your presence here compromises both." The cabin had fallen into the kind of silence that precedes explosions, every passenger holding their breath as they watched Victoria's careful veneer of civility finally crumble completely. Ashley, her assistant, had pressed herself against the galley wall, her face pale with embarrassment and fear as she watched her employer's public breakdown with growing horror. "What exactly do you think I'm going to do to you?" Jerome asked, his voice still calm, but carrying an edge now that spoke of years of accumulated frustration. "What threat do you think I pose by sitting here reading my thermodynamics textbook? Because I'd really like to understand what it is about my presence that makes you feel so unsafe." Victoria opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. Because, of course, she couldn't articulate the real reason for her discomfort without admitting to the racism that was driving her behavior. She couldn't say that Jerome's presence challenged her assumption that first class was a whites-only space, couldn't admit that seeing a young black man in clothes that didn't scream wealth had triggered every prejudice she'd been carrying since childhood. Instead, she did what entitled people often do when cornered. She escalated. "I know dangerous people when I see them," Victoria declared, her voice carrying throughout the aircraft, now reaching passengers 15 rows back. "And I'm not going to sit here and pretend that everything is fine when my safety is clearly being compromised. I want the air marshal called. I want this person vetted. How do we know he doesn't have a weapon? How do we know he's not planning something?" The words hit Jerome like physical blows, each accusation landing with the weight of centuries of racist stereotypes. He felt his carefully maintained composure beginning to crack, felt the tears threatening behind his eyes as Victoria transformed him from a student into a threat from a scholar, into a terrorist, all without knowing anything about him beyond the color of his skin. Dr. Chen's live stream exploded with comments, the viewer count climbing past 50,000, as people shared the link across social media platforms. Hashtag First Class Racism was trending nationally, now joined by hashtag Jerome Washington, after internet users quickly identified him through his MIT student page. The story was writing itself in real-time broadcast to the world by a pediatric surgeon who understood that some moments were too important not to document. The word weapon seemed to electrify the cabin like a lightning strike, transforming what had been an uncomfortable social situation into something that felt genuinely dangerous. Jerome felt his heart stop for a moment as he processed what Victoria had just accused him of, understanding instantly that her words could destroy his life in ways that went far beyond a delayed flight or public embarrassment. Maria, who had been trying to maintain professional calm throughout the confrontation, now looked genuinely alarmed. Accusations involving weapons triggered specific protocols, required certain responses that could escalate the situation beyond anyone's control. "Mrs. Ashford," she said, her voice tight with barely controlled urgency, "are you making an official complaint about passenger safety? Because if so, I need to notify the captain immediately, and that will require federal air marshals to become involved." Victoria sensed the power shift in her favor, the way that invoking security concerns suddenly made her the victim rather than the aggressor. "Yes," she said, her voice taking on a theatrical quality that Dr. Chen's camera captured perfectly. "I am officially concerned about the safety of this flight. This person has been aggressive and threatening, and I believe he may be carrying something that could endanger all of us." The lie was so blatant, so obviously contradicted by everything that had actually transpired, that several passengers audibly gasped. Jerome had done nothing but sit quietly, speak respectfully, and show his documentation when requested. He hadn't raised his voice, hadn't made threatening gestures, hadn't done anything that could be construed as aggressive by anyone operating in good faith. But good faith had been abandoned the moment Victoria decided that Jerome's presence in first class was personally offensive to her worldview. "That's not true," Jerome said, his voice finally showing the strain of the last 20 minutes. "I haven't threatened anyone. I haven't been aggressive. I've been sitting here reading my textbook trying to mind my own business while this woman has been screaming at me for reasons I can't understand." His hands were shaking now, the careful composure he'd maintained finally beginning to crack under the weight of false accusations that could follow him for the rest of his life. Dr. Chen adjusted her phone to capture the full scope of the scene, making sure her live stream audience could see Jerome's obvious distress contrasted against Victoria's theatrical performance. The comments were flowing too fast to read now, thousands of viewers expressing outrage, sharing stories of their own experiences with racism, demanding justice for the young student who was being systematically humiliated in front of the world. "Look at him!" Victoria shrieked, pointing an accusatory finger at Jerome as if his visible distress proved her point. "Look how agitated he's becoming. This is exactly what I was afraid of. He's becoming violent." The projection in her words was breathtaking in its audacity, transforming Jerome's natural response to being falsely accused into evidence of the very aggression she was claiming to have witnessed. That's when something inside Jerome finally snapped, not into violence, but into a kind of clarity that cut through the chaos like a blade. He stood up slowly, his movements deliberate and controlled, and turned to address not just Victoria, but the entire cabin that was watching this unfold. "My name is Jerome Washington," he said, his voice carrying clearly throughout the aircraft. "I'm a mechanical engineering student at MIT, maintaining a 3.9 GPA while working 2 part-time jobs to support myself. I just won the Innovation Tomorrow competition for designing water purification systems that could help provide clean drinking water to rural communities that don't have access to municipal systems." He paused, looking directly at Victoria before continuing. "I've never been arrested. I've never been in a fight. I volunteer at a literacy program for elementary school kids every Saturday morning when I'm not in class. And the most dangerous thing I'm carrying is a graphing calculator and a textbook on thermodynamics." The words hung in the air with the weight of truth, creating a stark contrast to Victoria's hysteria that was impossible for anyone to ignore. Around the cabin, passengers were nodding their expressions, shifting from uncertainty to clear support for the young man who was handling this impossible situation with more grace than most adults could manage. But Victoria was too far down the path of her own delusion to retreat now. "I don't believe any of that," she declared, her voice rising to levels that were clearly audible to passengers throughout the aircraft. "Anyone can claim to be a student. Anyone can make up stories about volunteering. What I see is a young man who doesn't belong in first class, who's been aggressive and threatening, and who's now trying to manipulate everyone with sob stories about his supposed achievements." Dr. Chen's live stream had reached 6 figures now, the video being shared across every social media platform, as people watched a real-time example of the racism that Black Americans faced every day. The hashtags were multiplying. #Justice. For Jerome. #Victoria Ashford. #First Class. While Black, each one trending higher as the story spread across the internet like wildfire. Jerome sat back down, not because he was defeated, but because he understood something that Victoria didn't. He had already won. Not because he was right, though he was, but because she had revealed herself so completely, so publicly, that there would be no coming back from this moment. Her mask had slipped entirely, showing the world exactly who she was and what she believed about people who looked like him. "I'm not moving," he said simply, his voice calm again now that he'd found his footing. "I belong here. I've earned the right to be here. And I'm not going to let your prejudice make me feel ashamed of existing in a space where I have every right to be." The words seemed to hit Victoria like a physical blow, her face contorting with a rage that went beyond the immediate situation to something deeper, something that had been festering inside her for years. And that's when she made the decision that would end everything. She reached for the call button and pressed it 3 times in rapid succession, the signal for a security emergency that would bring federal air marshals to the aircraft within minutes. The call button's urgent chime seemed to slice through the cabin like an alarm, and within seconds Maria was moving toward the cockpit with the kind of purposeful stride that indicated the situation had escalated beyond anything the flight crew could handle alone. The atmosphere in first class had shifted from uncomfortable to genuinely tense, with passengers who had been merely curious now looking genuinely concerned about what might happen next. Victoria stood triumphantly in the aisle, her chest heaving with exertion and vindication, convinced that she had finally taken the decisive action that would restore order to her world. Finally, she declared to anyone within earshot, "Someone in authority will handle this situation properly. You'll see that I was right to be concerned about the safety of this flight." But Jerome sat quietly in his seat, his hands folded in his lap, his engineering textbook still open to the chapter on fluid dynamics that he'd been trying to read when this nightmare began. He wasn't afraid anymore. Not exactly because he understood that he had done nothing wrong, had broken no laws, had threatened no one. Whatever happened next, it wouldn't be because of anything he had done. Doctor. Chen continued live streaming, her phone capturing every moment as the story unfolded in real time for an audience that had swelled to hundreds of thousands of viewers. The comments section had become a torrent of outrage and support, with people sharing their own stories of discrimination and demanding justice for Jerome. Several prominent civil rights organizations had already begun sharing the stream, amplifying its reach across platforms and demographics. The cockpit door opened with a pneumatic hiss that seemed to silence the entire cabin, and Captain Robert Mackenzie emerged with the kind of commanding presence that came from 25 years of military and commercial aviation. At 52, he was a man who had seen every variety of human behavior at 35,000 feet, but something about the scene before him made his jaw tighten with barely controlled anger. Captain Mackenzie was not the ally Victoria expected him to be. Born in Detroit's Corktown neighborhood to a family where his father worked the Ford assembly line and his mother cleaned offices downtown, he had learned early that respect was earned through character rather than inherited through privilege. His Navy service had reinforced those values, teaching him to judge people by their actions rather than their appearance, their competence rather than their connections. "What exactly is happening here?" Captain Mackenzie asked, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that commanded immediate attention. He surveyed the scene with military precision, taking in Victoria's flushed face and theatrical posturing, Jerome's careful composure and obvious distress, the phones that were recording from multiple angles, and Maria's barely controlled frustration. Victoria immediately launched into her performance, assuming that the captain would naturally side with a wealthy white passenger against a young black man. "Captain, thank goodness you're here," she gushed, stepping forward with the kind of conspiratorial intimacy that suggested shared understanding. "I'm Victoria Ashford. Perhaps you've heard of my late husband's pharmaceutical company. We have a serious security situation here that your flight attendant has been completely unable to handle." She gestured dramatically toward Jerome as if he were evidence of her claims. "This person has been aggressive and threatening throughout the boarding process. He's clearly in the wrong section of the aircraft, and when I tried to address the situation politely, he became hostile and defensive. I have serious concerns about what he might be planning, and I believe he may be carrying weapons or other dangerous items." Captain Mackenzie listened without interruption, his expression giving nothing away as Victoria built her case on a foundation of lies and innuendo. When she finished, he turned his attention to Jerome, and his approach was markedly different. "Son," he said, his voice respectful rather than accusatory, "can you tell me what happened? From your perspective?" Jerome looked up at the captain, and for the first time since this ordeal began, he felt a spark of hope that someone in authority might actually listen to the truth rather than assume the worst about him based on his appearance. "Sir," he said, his voice steady despite everything he'd endured, "I'm Jerome Washington, an engineering student at MIT. I won a competition that included an upgrade to first class for this flight to Geneva. I have all my documentation here." He gestured to his papers still spread across his tray table like evidence in a trial. "When I boarded, I went directly to my assigned seat and began reading my textbook. This woman approached and immediately demanded that I be moved, claiming I didn't belong in first class. I showed her my boarding pass and identification, but she refused to accept that I had a right to be here. She's been escalating the situation ever since, making false accusations about me being aggressive or threatening." Captain Mackenzie examined Jerome's documentation with the same careful attention he would give to a pre-flight checklist, noting the scholarship letter, the competition certificate, the boarding pass that clearly showed first-class seat assignment. "These all appear to be in perfect order," he said, looking at Victoria with an expression that suggested his patience was wearing thin. "Of course they appear legitimate," Victoria interjected, her voice taking on a desperate edge as she sensed that things weren't going according to her plan. "But anyone can forge documents these days. What matters is that this person doesn't belong in first class. Look at him. Look at his clothes, his bag, his whole demeanor. Does he look like someone who can afford a $12,000 ticket?" The question hung in the air like a confession, revealing exactly what Victoria's objections were really based on. Not safety, not security, not any legitimate concern about Jerome's behavior or documentation, but simply her belief that someone who looked like him, dressed like him, couldn't possibly belong in the same space as someone like her. Captain Mackenzie's expression hardened as he realized what he was dealing with. This wasn't a security issue or a documentation problem or a miscommunication between passengers. This was racism, pure and simple, dressed up in the language of concern and safety, but revealing itself through every word Victoria spoke. "Ma'am," he said, his voice taking on the kind of formal tone that indicated official displeasure, "are you telling me that you've created this entire disturbance because you don't believe this passenger looks like he belongs in first class? Are you seriously suggesting that someone's right to occupy a seat they've paid for should be determined by your assessment of their appearance or their ability to afford the ticket?" Victoria's face flushed even deeper as she realized that her arguments weren't landing the way she'd expected. "I'm saying that I have legitimate safety concerns," she insisted, but her voice lacked the conviction it had carried earlier. "I'm saying that I don't feel comfortable, and as a paying passenger, I should have the right to feel secure during my flight." Captain Mackenzie nodded slowly, as if he were considering her words carefully. Then he reached for the intercom handset that would allow him to address the entire aircraft, and Victoria's face lit up with triumph, convinced that he was about to vindicate her position and remove Jerome from first class. She had no idea that she was about to experience the most public humiliation of her life. Captain Mackenzie held the intercom handset for a moment, his eyes moving between Victoria's expectant face and Jerome's resigned expression. The entire cabin held its breath, passengers in economy craning their necks to see what was happening, flight attendants pausing in their duties to witness what everyone sensed would be a defining moment. Dr. Chen's live stream had reached nearly 1 million viewers, the story spreading across social media faster than wildfire, as people shared the link with growing outrage and anticipation. Victoria stood straighter, smoothing her platinum hair with one hand while adjusting her expensive coat with the other, preparing for what she was certain would be her moment of vindication. She had played this scene countless times throughout her privileged life, invoking her status and connections to bend the world to her will, and she had no reason to believe this time would be any different. "Ladies and gentlemen," Captain Mackenzie's voice boomed through the aircraft's speakers, reaching every passenger from first class to the last row of economy. "This is your captain speaking. I apologize for the delay in our departure, but we've encountered a situation that requires my immediate attention and action." Victoria's smile widened as she prepared to wave graciously at the economy passengers who would witness her triumph over the young man who had dared to challenge her authority. She had already planned her response to Jerome's removal, the magnanimous way she would tell the media that she held no personal animosity toward him, that this had simply been about maintaining proper standards and security protocols. "Federal Aviation Administration regulations grant me absolute authority over the safety and operation of this aircraft." Captain Mackenzie continued, his voice carrying the weight of law and military precision. "This authority includes the power to remove any passenger who poses a threat to the safety of the flight, interferes with the duties of crew members, or creates a disruptive environment that compromises the welfare of other passengers." Victoria nodded approvingly, certain that every word was leading to Jerome's removal and public humiliation. Around the cabin, phones were recording capturing what everyone assumed would be another example of a young black man being ejected from a space where he allegedly didn't belong. But Captain Mackenzie wasn't finished. "I have just completed a thorough investigation of the incident that has delayed our departure," he announced, his voice taking on the kind of formal tone that indicated official judgment. "I have reviewed all documentation, interviewed witnesses, and observed the behavior of all parties involved. Based on this investigation, I am exercising my federal authority to remove a passenger whose conduct has been disruptive, threatening, and completely unacceptable." Victoria's chest swelled with vindication, her hand moving to her heart in a gesture of relieved gratitude. She had won, just as she always did, just as the natural order of things demanded. Money and status and the right skin color had triumphed once again over pretensions and paperwork and inappropriate ambitions. Therefore, Captain Mackenzie continued, his eyes locking directly onto Victoria's face with an intensity that made her smile falter slightly. "I am ordering the immediate removal of the passenger in seat 1B. The words seemed to hang in the air for an eternal moment, their meaning slowly penetrating the fog of Victoria's certainty. Seat 1B. Her seat. Not Jerome's seat. Her seat. The captain was talking about her. What Victoria whispered the word barely audible over the sudden murmur of voices throughout the cabin. Passengers were looking at each other in confusion, then turning back toward first class as they realized what had just happened. "Mrs. Victoria Ashford," Captain Mackenzie continued, his voice now carrying clearly to every corner of the aircraft, "you will gather your belongings and exit this aircraft immediately. You have harassed a fellow passenger, made false accusations against him, disrupted the boarding process, and wasted federal resources with frivolous security concerns based solely on your personal prejudices." Victoria's face went through a series of expressions that would have been comical if they weren't so revealing: confusion, denial, dawning horror, and finally explosive rage. "You can't be serious," she said, her voice rising to a pitch that bordered on hysteria. "I'm the victim here. I'm the one who was threatened. I'm the one who needs protection." But Captain Mackenzie was far from finished with her public education. Furthermore, he announced to the aircraft, "Federal regulations require me to inform law enforcement when passengers make false accusations or file frivolous security reports. Mrs. Ashford, you will be met by Port Authority police officers who will escort you from the aircraft and determine whether criminal charges are warranted for filing a false report and interfering with flight operations." The cabin erupted, not in the polite applause that sometimes followed difficult passenger removals, but in genuine cheering that started in economy and swept forward through the aircraft like a wave. Passengers who had witnessed Victoria's behavior, who had seen her systematic humiliation of Jerome, who had watched her invoke security concerns to mask her obvious racism, were celebrating justice being served in real time. Victoria spun around wildly, looking for allies, for anyone who shared her perspective, for someone who would validate her worldview and support her position. But she found only faces ranging from uncomfortable to openly hostile phones, recording her meltdown, people actively celebrating her downfall. The world had shifted around her completely, and she found herself on the wrong side of public opinion without understanding how it had happened. "This is insane," she shrieked, her carefully maintained composure completely shattered now. "I know the CEO of this airline. I know senators and congressmen. I know people who can end your career with a single phone call." The threats that had always worked before sounded hollow, now desperate and pathetic in the face of her public humiliation. Dr. Chen's live stream chat was moving too fast to read comments celebrating the captain's decision, sharing the video across every platform, creating hashtags that were trending globally within minutes. Hashtag Captain Mackenzie, hashtag Justice at Altitude, hashtag First Class Karma were all climbing the trending lists as people around the world watched racism being confronted and defeated in real time. Jerome sat in stunned silence, unable to process what was happening. After 20 minutes of being told he didn't belong, of being accused of aggression and terrorism, of watching his character assassinated in front of strangers, the tables had turned so completely that he couldn't quite believe it was real. Son Captain Mackenzie said, turning away from Victoria's ongoing meltdown to address Jerome directly, "You handled yourself with remarkable dignity throughout this ordeal. I want to personally apologize that you had to endure this kind of treatment on my aircraft. Your documentation is impeccable. Your behavior has been exemplary, and you absolutely belong in that seat." The validation hit Jerome like a physical force tears threatening behind his eyes, as someone in authority finally acknowledged what he had known all along, that he had done nothing wrong, that he belonged exactly where he was, that the problem had never been him. But Victoria wasn't finished fighting. "You're all making a terrible mistake," she screamed as Port Authority officers appeared at the aircraft's entrance, their presence confirming that Captain Mackenzie's announcement hadn't been an empty threat. "This boy is dangerous. He's planning something. You'll see, when something terrible happens on this flight. Remember that I tried to warn you." The officers, who had seen every variety of unruly passenger behavior in their years of airport security, approached Victoria with professional calm. "Ma'am," the lead officer said, "we need you to gather your belongings and come with us." "Don't touch me!" Victoria shrieked, backing away from the officers and bumping into other passengers. "This is kidnapping. This is assault. I'm being persecuted for trying to keep everyone safe." She grabbed her heavy leather handbag and swung it wildly, the metal corner catching one of the officers on the forearm. That single moment of contact changed everything. What had been a removal for disruptive behavior became an arrest for assaulting a federal officer. The handcuffs came out, the Miranda rights were read, and Victoria Ashford, pharmaceutical heiress and Manhattan socialite, was led through the entire length of the aircraft in restraints, while 300 passengers cheered her departure. As the aircraft door closed behind Victoria and her police escort, the cabin fell into a strange silence, as if everyone was processing what they had just witnessed. Then slowly, passengers began to approach Jerome, offering words of support, sharing their own stories of discrimination, treating him not as a curiosity, but as a fellow human being who had shown remarkable grace under pressure. Captain Mackenzie returned to the cockpit to prepare for departure, but not before stopping one more time at Jerome's seat. "Mr. Washington," he said, "when we reach Geneva, I'd like you to consider this." He handed Jerome a business card for Delta's engineering recruitment program. "We could use someone with your combination of technical skills and personal character." As Flight 447 finally pushed back from the gate, Jerome looked out his window at the lights of New York fading below, understanding that his life had just changed in ways he couldn't yet comprehend. But for now, it was enough to know that justice had been served, that dignity had triumphed over prejudice, and that sometimes the system actually worked the way it was supposed to. The transformation of the first-class cabin was nothing short of miraculous. Where 20 minutes earlier there had been tension thick enough to cut with a knife, now there was an atmosphere of celebration and camaraderie that felt almost surreal. Passengers who had been uncomfortable witnesses to Victoria's racist tirade were now approaching Jerome with genuine warmth, offering handshakes, sharing their own stories, treating him like a hero rather than an intruder. Dr. Chen finally ended her live stream, but not before capturing Jerome's gracious responses to his fellow passengers and the moment when Captain Mackenzie handed him the business card. The video had been shared millions of times across every social media platform, spawning countless reaction videos, think pieces, and discussions about racism in air travel. The hashtags were trending globally now, and Jerome had become an unwilling symbol of dignity in the face of discrimination. "Young man," said the elderly businessman in seat 3A, a distinguished gentleman with silver hair and an expensive suit, who had watched the entire confrontation with growing disgust at Victoria's behavior. "I'm Richard Hartwell, retired federal judge, and I want you to know that what I witnessed here today was textbook discrimination, If that woman tries to retaliate against you in any way, you call me immediately." He handed Jerome his card, and Jerome noticed that several other passengers were nodding in agreement. Maria, the flight attendant who had tried so hard to protect Jerome throughout the ordeal, appeared beside his seat with a crystal champagne flute and a warm smile that reached her eyes. "Mr. Washington," she said, "this is with the compliments of the captain and the entire crew. You handled yourself with more grace and dignity than we see from most passengers on their best days, and you certainly deserved better treatment than what you received." Jerome accepted the champagne with hands that were still shaking slightly from the adrenaline of the last half hour. "Thank you," he said, his voice still carrying traces of disbelief at how completely the situation had been reversed. "I just want to get to Geneva and present my research. I never expected anything like this to happen." "That's exactly why it did happen," Dr. Chen said, approaching from her seat 3 rows back. "Because you were just trying to exist in a space where you belonged, and someone couldn't handle that reality. But look what you accomplished by standing your ground. You didn't just defend yourself, you created a teaching moment that millions of people are watching right now." She showed Jerome her phone, where the view count on her video had climbed past 5 million and was still rising. Comments were pouring in from around the world, people sharing their own experiences with discrimination, thanking Jerome for his composure, celebrating Captain Mackenzie's decision, and expressing hope that this moment might represent a turning point in how these situations were handled. But Jerome wasn't thinking about viral fame or social media impact. He was thinking about his grandmother back in Millerville, Alabama, who had sacrificed everything to make sure he could get an education, who had worked double shifts cleaning houses so he could buy textbooks, who had prayed every night that the world would recognize his worth. This moment, as painful as it had been, was proof that her sacrifices hadn't been in vain. Captain Mackenzie's voice came over the intercom one final time before takeoff. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've been cleared for departure and should reach Geneva right on schedule. I want to thank all of our passengers for their patience during the delay, and I want to commend everyone for standing up for what's right when it mattered most. That's the kind of community I'm proud to serve." As the aircraft pushed back from the gate and began its taxi toward the runway, Jerome finally allowed himself to open his thermodynamics textbook again. But he found it impossible to concentrate on fluid dynamics equations when his phone was buzzing constantly with notifications, interview requests, scholarship offers, and messages of support from around the world. The woman in seat 2. A technology executive who had watched Victoria's meltdown with obvious disgust, leaned over toward Jerome. "I run a diversity initiative at my company," she said quietly. "We're always looking for talented engineers who understand what it's like to overcome barriers. When you finish your degree, I'd love to talk to you about opportunities." She handed him her card, adding to the growing collection in Jerome's pocket. As Flight 447 lifted off from JFK and climbed into the night sky over the Atlantic, Jerome looked down at the lights of New York fading below and understood that his life had just taken a turn he never could have anticipated. The young man who had boarded this plane, feeling like an imposter, was now being treated like a respected member of a community that had rallied around him when it mattered most. Dr. Chen's live stream had ended, but the conversation it sparked was just beginning. Social media was exploding with discussions about discrimination in air travel, the courage required to stand up to racism, and the importance of allies who are willing to document injustice when they see it. Jerome's name was being mentioned alongside civil rights heroes, his dignity under pressure being held up as an example of grace under fire. But perhaps most importantly, Victoria's public humiliation was serving as a warning to others who might harbor similar prejudices. The world was watching now, and actions that might once have gone unchallenged would no longer be tolerated. The viral nature of Dr. Chen's video had created a new standard of accountability, where racism could no longer hide behind coded language or plausible deniability. As the aircraft reached cruising altitude and the cabin lights dimmed for the overnight flight to Geneva, Jerome finally felt safe enough to close his eyes and try to process everything that had happened. Tomorrow he would present his research on water purification systems to an international audience of engineers and scientists. But tonight he had already achieved something more important. He had proven that dignity and truth could triumph over prejudice and power, and that sometimes standing your ground was the most important thing you could do. Dr. Chen's decision to livestream Victoria's racist tirade had unleashed something far beyond what anyone could have anticipated. Within 6 hours of Flight 447's departure from JFK, her video had been shared over 8 million times across every social media platform, spawning a digital wildfire that was consuming the internet with unprecedented speed and intensity. The hashtag first class. While Black was trending #1 worldwide, joined by hashtag Jerome Washington, hashtag Captain Mackenzie, and hashtag Victoria Ashford, as people around the globe weighed in on what they had witnessed. The video itself had been edited and re-edited countless times, with people creating reaction videos, analysis pieces, and educational content about the realities of racism in modern America. On Twitter, the story dominated the trending topics as celebrities, politicians, civil rights leaders, and ordinary citizens shared their thoughts about Jerome's dignified response to Victoria's attack. Oprah Winfrey tweeted, "This young man's grace under pressure is a masterclass in dignity. We see you, Jerome Washington, and we're proud of you." The tweet was retweeted over 500,000 times within an hour. Reddit had multiple threads analyzing every aspect of the incident, with users who claimed to be airline employees sharing stories of similar confrontations they had witnessed. The legal community was dissecting Captain Mackenzie's decision to remove Victoria, with constitutional law professors praising his understanding of federal aviation regulations and his commitment to treating all passengers equally, regardless of their economic status or race. But perhaps most significantly, the internet detectives had gone to work identifying everyone involved in the incident. Jerome's background as an MIT engineering student and scholarship winner had been confirmed within an hour, with his professors and classmates sharing stories of his academic excellence and personal character. His grandmother's interview with a local Alabama news station, where she spoke with obvious pride about her grandson's achievements, had been viewed millions of times. Victoria's identity had been established even faster thanks to her prominent social media presence and her habit of documenting her wealthy lifestyle online. Her Instagram account, filled with photos of luxury vacations, expensive handbags, and charity galas where she posed with other Manhattan socialites, provided a stark contrast to her behavior on the aircraft. Within hours, internet users had compiled a comprehensive dossier of her privileged background, her inherited wealth, and her history of entitled behavior. The pharmaceutical company founded by her late husband was facing immediate backlash, with customers threatening boycotts and investors expressing concern about the reputational damage. Victoria's position on various charitable boards was being questioned, with organizations scrambling to distance themselves from someone who had become the face of modern racism in America. Meanwhile, GoFundMe pages had sprouted like mushrooms after rain. Support Jerome Washington's education had raised over $200,000 in its first day, with contributors ranging from fellow students to Fortune 500 CEOs who wanted to show their support for a young man who had handled discrimination with such remarkable dignity. The page's comment section had become a place where people shared their own stories of discrimination and celebrated Jerome's courage. Captain Mackenzie was being hailed as a hero across social media, with airline employees creating tribute videos and passengers sharing stories of his fairness and professionalism. Delta Airlines, initially cautious about the public relations implications, had quickly recognized the positive response and issued a statement supporting their captain's decision and commending him for upholding their values of dignity and respect for all passengers. The viral nature of the story had attracted attention from major news networks, with CNN, NBC, and even international outlets picking up the story and providing analysis of what it revealed about racism in America. Legal experts were being interviewed about the implications of false accusations in air travel, while sociologists discussed the broader patterns of discrimination that people of color faced in spaces traditionally associated with wealth and privilege. Dr. Chen, who had made the split-second decision to document the incident, was being interviewed by major media outlets about her choice to live stream such a sensitive situation. As a person of color in a professional field, she explained to Anderson Cooper, "I recognized what was happening immediately. I've faced similar situations in hospitals, at conferences, in first-class cabins. The difference is that this time I had the power to make sure it was seen and documented." The comments on her original video had become a forum for people to share their own experiences with discrimination, creating a massive digital archive of stories that had previously been dismissed or ignored. Teachers were using the video in classrooms to discuss bias and privilege. Corporate diversity trainers were incorporating it into their programs, and civil rights organizations were holding it up as an example of how individual acts of courage could create broader social change. But perhaps most remarkably, the story was inspiring action beyond social media. Airlines across the industry were reviewing their policies and training programs, recognizing that the public would no longer tolerate discrimination being disguised as security concerns or customer service issues. The Federal Aviation Administration had announced a review of how passenger complaints were handled, particularly when they involved accusations that appeared to be based on racial profiling. Jerome himself, still en route to Geneva and largely unaware of the digital storm he had sparked, was receiving thousands of messages of support, scholarship offers, job opportunities, and invitations to speak at universities and conferences. His email inbox was overflowing with interview requests from major media outlets, all wanting to hear his perspective on what had happened and what it meant for the broader conversation about racism in America. The story had also sparked a broader discussion about the role of bystanders in confronting discrimination, Dr. Chen's decision to document and broadcast the incident had demonstrated how individual witnesses could use technology to hold people accountable for racist behavior, creating a new model for how ordinary citizens could support victims of discrimination. Social media users were sharing tips about how to safely document discrimination when they witnessed it, how to support victims without making the situation worse, and how to use their privilege and platforms to amplify marginalized voices. The hashtag #BeAWitness was trending alongside the original tags, with people committing to speak up when they saw injustice rather than remaining silent bystanders. As Flight 447 crossed the Atlantic toward Geneva, the conversation Jerome's dignity had sparked was reshaping how America talked about racism, discrimination, and the power of individual courage to create broader social change. What had begun as one woman's attempt to humiliate a young man she deemed unworthy of first-class treatment had become a global moment of reckoning with the prejudices that still plagued modern society. Victoria Ashford's night in the Port Authority holding cells at JFK was a harsh introduction to a reality she had never imagined possible. The woman who had spent her entire adult life insulated by wealth and privilege now found herself stripped of her jewelry, her belt, her dignity, sitting on a concrete bench in a jumpsuit that smelled of industrial detergent and the desperation of countless previous occupants. The charges against her were serious and mounting. Disorderly conduct interfering with flight operations, making false statements to federal authorities, and assault on a law enforcement officer were just the beginning. The Port Authority officers who had arrested her were experienced professionals who had seen every variety of airport meltdown, but even they were shocked by the level of entitlement and racism Victoria had displayed in front of hundreds of witnesses and millions of online viewers. Her phone call to her high-powered attorney Mitchell Steinberg did not go as she expected. Steinberg, whose clientele consisted primarily of wealthy Manhattan socialites and corporate executives who found themselves in legal trouble, had built his career on making problems disappear quietly and expensively. But this problem was different. Victoria Steinberg said, his voice carrying none of the reassuring confidence she was accustomed to hearing. "Have you seen the video?" When she admitted that she hadn't, his silence spoke volumes. "It's been viewed over 10 million times. Your behavior is documented in high definition from multiple angles. There's no way to spin this, no way to claim misunderstanding or miscommunication. You're on camera making explicitly racist statements to a young man who is sitting quietly in his assigned seat." The reality of her situation began to penetrate Victoria's wall of denial as Steinberg explained the legal implications of her actions. Federal charges carried serious penalties, and the public nature of her behavior meant that prosecutors would be under intense pressure to pursue the case aggressively. The assault on the officer, caught clearly on Dr. Chen's live stream, had transformed what might have been a misdemeanor into a felony with potential prison time. But the criminal charges were only the beginning of Victoria's problems. By morning, the boards of 3 major charitable organizations had called emergency meetings to discuss her removal. The Wellington Foundation for Pharmaceutical Research, which she had chaired since her husband's death, voted unanimously to terminate her position and distance the organization from her actions. The Manhattan Arts Council, the Children's Hospital Foundation, and the Symphony Society all followed suit within hours. Her financial portfolio was suffering immediate damage as well. Victoria's wealth was largely tied up in publicly traded pharmaceutical companies, and the association with viral racism was causing stock prices to fluctuate, as investors worried about reputational damage. Her financial advisor called to inform her that several investment funds were considering divestment from any company associated with her name. The social consequences were equally devastating. Victoria's phone buzzed constantly with text messages from former friends and associates, but none of them were offering support. Margaret Pemberton, her closest friend for 15 years, sent a brief message. "I can't believe you would behave that way. Please don't contact me again." Similar messages followed from women she had lunched with, vacationed with, served on boards with for decades. The doorman at her Fifth Avenue building informed her that reporters were camped outside waiting for her return. Paparazzi had already obtained photos of her being led away in handcuffs, and those images were being shared endlessly across social media and news outlets. The New York Post's front page featured a particularly unflattering photo of her mid-scream with the headline, "First-Class Trash," in bold letters. Her country club membership was suspended pending review. Her personal trainer, hairdresser, and regular restaurants all called to inform her that they would no longer be able to accommodate her. Even her longtime housekeeper, Maria, gave her 2 weeks' notice, explaining that she couldn't work for someone who had treated another person the way Victoria had treated Jerome. Jerome, meanwhile, had made a decision that surprised everyone, including his legal advisors. Despite overwhelming encouragement to pursue civil litigation against Victoria, he chose a different path. "I don't want her money," he told the team of civil rights lawyers who had volunteered to represent him. "I want to finish my education, present my research, and build water purification systems that can help people. Spending years in court won't accomplish any of those goals." His decision to focus on his future rather than revenge garnered even more admiration from the public, with many seeing it as further evidence of his remarkable character. The GoFundMe campaign that had been established to support his education continued to grow, reaching over $500,000 as people around the world contributed to ensuring that his bright future wouldn't be derailed by Victoria's attempt to destroy it. The legal proceedings against Victoria moved forward with unusual speed, partly due to the overwhelming evidence and partly because of the public pressure for justice. Her arraignment was a media circus, with reporters and protesters outside the courthouse demanding accountability for her actions. The judge, noting the serious nature of the charges and the flight risk posed by Victoria's wealth, set bail at $50,000, a sum that would have been trivial for her just days earlier but was now complicated by her rapidly deteriorating financial situation. Victoria's attempt to maintain her lifestyle while facing legal consequences proved unsustainable. Her legal fees alone were mounting into the hundreds of thousands of dollars, and the reputational damage was affecting her ability to access the lines of credit she had always taken for granted. Banks that had courted her business for decades were suddenly reluctant to extend loans to someone whose name had become synonymous with racist behavior. The pharmaceutical company that bore her late husband's name made the difficult decision to rebrand entirely, recognizing that the Ashford name had become toxic to their business. The board of directors, many of whom had known Victoria personally for years, voted to buy out her shares at a significant discount, effectively forcing her out of the company her husband had built. As the legal process continued, Victoria was required to attend anger management classes and diversity training as a condition of her bail. The irony of being forced to learn about the very prejudices she had displayed so publicly was not lost on anyone, least of all the other participants in the program, who recognized her from the viral video. But perhaps the most devastating consequence for Victoria was the complete collapse of the social world that had defined her identity for decades. The charity galas, country club events, and exclusive dinner parties that had been the center of her existence were now closed to her. She had become a pariah in the very circles where she had once been celebrated, a cautionary tale about how quickly privilege could be stripped away when someone revealed their true character. The legal system, which Victoria had always assumed would protect people like her from the consequences of their actions, instead became the instrument of her accountability. The federal prosecutor assigned to her case, a young black woman named Angela Torres, pursued the charges with the kind of methodical precision that left no room for the influence peddling and favor trading that Victoria had always assumed would save her from real consequences. As Victoria sat in her attorney's office signing documents that would formally resolve the criminal charges through a plea agreement that included community service, probation, and substantial fines, she finally began to understand the magnitude of what she had lost. Her attempt to humiliate a young black student had instead exposed her own moral bankruptcy to the world, costing her everything she had spent her life accumulating: wealth, status, respect, and power. The woman who had boarded Flight 447, convinced of her superiority and entitlement, emerged from the legal system stripped of almost everything that had defined her identity, forced to confront the reality that actions have consequences, even for people who had spent their lives believing they were above accountability. The viral nature of Dr. Chen's video had created something unprecedented in corporate America, a moment when doing the right thing aligned perfectly with good business sense. Within 48 hours of Flight 447's landing in Geneva, Delta Airlines found itself at the center of a public relations victory that no marketing campaign could have manufactured, and they moved quickly to capitalize on the moment while implementing genuine reforms. CEO Patricia Williams convened an emergency meeting of the executive leadership team, recognizing that the company had been handed an opportunity to lead an industry-wide conversation about discrimination in air travel. "We have two choices," she told her assembled executives, many of whom were still processing the implications of Captain Mackenzie's decision. "We can treat this as a crisis to be managed, or we can treat it as an opportunity to demonstrate our values in a way that creates lasting change." The decision was unanimous. Delta would use this moment to implement the most comprehensive anti-discrimination training program in aviation history. The company immediately announced a partnership with leading civil rights organizations to develop new protocols for handling passenger complaints, particularly those that appeared to be motivated by racial profiling rather than legitimate safety concerns. Captain Mackenzie, who had returned from Geneva to find himself the subject of national attention, was promoted to Chief of Flight Operations and tasked with developing new training modules for pilots and crew members. His military background and demonstrated commitment to equality made him the perfect spokesperson for a new era of aviation leadership that prioritized dignity and respect for all passengers. "What people don't understand," Captain Mackenzie explained to a packed auditorium of Delta employees, "is that the moment I saw that young man's documentation and observed his behavior, it was obvious that this wasn't a security issue. This was a character test, and I'm proud that our airline passed it. His words were met with standing ovation from employees who recognized that their company's reputation had been enhanced rather than damaged by taking a principled stand. The new training program, developed in partnership with the NAACP and the Anti-Defamation League, focused on recognizing implicit bias and distinguishing between legitimate security concerns and discriminatory complaints. Flight attendants were given specific protocols for documenting incidents and supporting targeted passengers, while gate agents received training on identifying and addressing passenger profiling. But the changes extended far beyond Delta. The viral nature of the incident had caught the attention of congressional leaders who recognized an opportunity to address systemic issues in air travel. Representative Alexandria Morrison, chair of the House Transportation Committee, announced hearings on discrimination in aviation with Jerome and Captain McKenzie, both invited to testify about their experiences. The Federal Aviation Administration, responding to public pressure and congressional oversight, issued new guidelines requiring all airlines to report incidents of passenger discrimination and to implement standardized training programs addressing implicit bias. The guidelines also established passenger rights protections, specifically addressing racial profiling and discriminatory enforcement of airline policies. Corporate America took notice as well. Human resources departments across industries began incorporating the Flight 447 incident into their diversity training programs, using Victoria's behavior as a case study in how unconscious bias could manifest in professional settings. Business schools added the incident to their ethics curricula, analyzing Captain McKenzie's decision-making process as an example of values-based leadership under pressure. The technology sector, always quick to capitalize on social trends, developed new applications and platforms designed to document and report discrimination in real time. Dr. Chen's live streaming approach had demonstrated the power of immediate documentation, and entrepreneurs quickly created tools to make such documentation easier and more effective for ordinary citizens. Jerome himself had become an inadvertent spokesperson for educational equity and merit-based achievement. Universities across the country invited him to speak about his experience, and his message consistently focused on the importance of education as a tool for overcoming prejudice and creating opportunities. His water purification research, originally intended for rural communities in Alabama, was now being funded by major corporations eager to associate themselves with his story of dignity and innovation. The MIT Engineering Department established the Jerome Washington Scholarship Fund for first-generation college students, with initial funding provided by donations inspired by his story. The scholarship specifically targeted students from underrepresented communities who demonstrated both academic excellence and personal character, ensuring that future generations would have opportunities similar to what Jerome had earned through his own merit. Perhaps most significantly, the incident had sparked a broader conversation about allyship and the responsibility of witnesses to discrimination. Dr. Chen's decision to document and broadcast Victoria's behavior had created a new model for how bystanders could use their privilege and platforms to support victims of racism. Corporate training programs began emphasizing the importance of speaking up when discrimination was witnessed rather than remaining silent bystanders. Airlines across the industry implemented new policies addressing passenger complaints that appeared motivated by racial profiling. American Airlines announced a partnership with the ACLU to review their complaint procedures, while United Airlines established an ombudsman program specifically designed to investigate incidents of potential discrimination. The competitive pressure to demonstrate commitment to equality had created an industry-wide race to implement meaningful reforms. The hospitality industry more broadly had taken notice as well. Hotel chains, restaurants, and retail establishments began reviewing their policies and training programs, recognizing that the public would no longer tolerate discrimination disguised as customer service concerns. The viral nature of social media meant that racist behavior could be exposed and punished more quickly than ever before, creating powerful incentives for businesses to proactively address bias in their operations. Law enforcement agencies that operated in transportation hubs also revised their protocols, recognizing that the Port Authority officer's professional handling of Victoria's arrest had been crucial to the positive resolution of the incident. New training programs emphasized de-escalation techniques and the importance of recognizing when passenger complaints might be motivated by bias rather than legitimate safety concerns. Educational institutions, from elementary schools to graduate programs, incorporated the Flight 447 incident into their curricula, using it as a starting point for discussions about privilege, prejudice, and the power of individual courage to create broader social change. Jerome's dignified response and Captain Mackenzie's principled leadership became case studies in character education programs across the country. The incident had also sparked important conversations in medical education, where Dr. Chen's experience as a person of color in a predominantly white profession resonated with many healthcare workers. Medical schools began incorporating discussions of bias in healthcare settings into their training programs, recognizing that the same prejudices that had targeted Jerome in first class could affect patient care and professional advancement in medical settings. The legal community used Victoria's case as an example of how federal regulations could be enforced to protect civil rights in transportation settings. Law schools added the incident to their civil rights curricula, analyzing the interplay between Federal Aviation Authority and anti-discrimination protections. The case became a teaching tool for understanding how individual actions could trigger institutional responses and legal consequences. As the reforms spread throughout the transportation industry and beyond, it became clear that Dr. Chen's split-second decision to document Victoria's behavior had created a watershed moment in the fight against everyday racism. The incident had demonstrated that individual acts of courage and dignity could create ripple effects that extended far beyond the immediate situation, inspiring institutional changes that would protect countless future travelers from experiencing the kind of discrimination Jerome had faced. The transformation wasn't perfect, and challenges remained, but Flight 447 had created a new standard of accountability that made discriminatory behavior riskier and more expensive than ever before, while providing a model for how institutions could respond to bias with meaningful action rather than empty words. The weeks following Jerome's return from Geneva were a whirlwind of media attention, speaking engagements, and opportunities that he never could have imagined when he first boarded Flight 447. But beneath the public celebration of his dignity and courage, Jerome was struggling with the psychological impact of being publicly humiliated and falsely accused in front of millions of viewers around the world. Dr. Sarah Martinez, the therapist recommended by MIT's counseling services, specialized in helping students of color process experiences with racism and discrimination. Her office became a sanctuary where Jerome could finally express the anger, hurt, and confusion that he had been forced to suppress during the incident and its aftermath. "What Victoria did to you was a form of psychological violence," Dr. Martinez explained during one of their sessions. "She attempted to strip you of your dignity, your right to occupy space, your very humanity. The fact that you maintained your composure doesn't mean you weren't deeply harmed by what happened." Jerome found relief in having his pain acknowledged and validated by someone who understood the unique trauma of public racism. The nightmares had started during his second night in Geneva Dreams, where he was trapped in the first-class cabin while Victoria's accusations grew louder and more threatening, where the other passengers turned against him, where Captain Mackenzie sided with his accuser. He would wake up sweating, his heart racing, reliving the moment when he realized that a false accusation could destroy everything he had worked for. Dr. Martinez helped him understand that his hypervigilance in public spaces, his tendency to over-document his credentials, his exhaustion from constantly proving his right to exist in professional settings were all normal responses to racial trauma. "You've been carrying the burden of other people's prejudices your entire life," she told him. What happened on that plane was just the most visible example of something you've been navigating since childhood. Back in Millerville, Alabama, Jerome's grandmother, Ruby, had become something of a local celebrity herself. The interview she had given to the local news station, where she spoke with fierce pride about her grandson's achievements and character, had been viewed millions of times. Neighbors and church members who had watched Jerome grow up were stopping by her small house to share their own pride in the young man who had represented their community with such dignity. Baby Ruby told Jerome during one of their nightly phone calls, "Your mama and daddy are looking down from heaven and smiling so big. You showed the whole world what it means to walk with your head high no matter what anybody tries to do to tear you down." Her words carried the wisdom of someone who had lived through the civil rights era, who understood the weight of representing an entire community when the spotlight was on you. The financial support from the GoFundMe campaign had eliminated Jerome's student loan debt and provided a cushion that allowed him to focus on his studies without the constant worry about making rent or affording textbooks. But more importantly, the emotional support from strangers around the world had helped him understand that he was not alone in his experience, that his dignity had inspired others who had faced similar challenges. Dr. Chen had become an unexpected mentor and friend, checking in regularly to see how Jerome was processing the attention and offering advice based on her own experience as a person of color in a demanding profession. "The hardest part," she told him, "is learning to trust that the support is genuine, that people really do admire your character rather than just seeing you as a symbol. You're allowed to be human, to have bad days, to be angry about what happened." Captain Mackenzie had also maintained contact, sharing wisdom from his own experiences with leadership under pressure. "Son," he told Jerome during one of their conversations, "what you did on that plane wasn't just about standing up for yourself. You showed everyone watching that dignity and truth are more powerful than hatred and lies. That's a lesson this country needed to learn." The speaking engagements that Jerome began accepting at universities and conferences became part of his healing process, opportunities to transform his painful experience into something that could help others. His message consistently focused on the power of education, the importance of allies like Dr. Chen and Captain Mackenzie, and the reality that individual dignity could create broader social change. At MIT, Jerome found that his experience had changed how other students and faculty members interacted with him. Where before he had sometimes felt invisible or tokenized, now he was seen as someone who had demonstrated remarkable character under pressure. His professors began incorporating his story into their discussions of ethics and engineering, helping students understand how their professional choices could impact broader social justice issues. The water purification research that had originally earned him the trip to Geneva was now being funded at levels that would allow him to test his systems in multiple rural communities. The irony wasn't lost on him that Victoria's attempt to humiliate him had instead provided the resources and attention that would help bring clean drinking water to communities that needed it most. Jerome's relationship with his own identity had evolved through the experience as well. Where he had once worried about being seen as representing his entire race, he now understood that his individual excellence and character could inspire others without requiring him to be perfect or superhuman. Dr. Martinez helped him see that his vulnerability and healing process were just as important as his public dignity had been. The trauma of the incident would never completely disappear, but Jerome was learning to carry it differently. Instead of shame about being targeted, he felt pride in how he had responded. Instead of anger at the injustice, he felt determination to create a world where other young people wouldn't face similar challenges. Instead of isolation from the experience, he felt connection to a community of people who had supported him through his most difficult moment. Victoria, meanwhile, had begun her own journey toward understanding, though it was a much more difficult path. Court-mandated therapy sessions and community service requirements were forcing her to confront the prejudices that had driven her behavior, though her progress was slow and often grudging. Her therapist, Dr. James Wilson had experience working with individuals who had committed hate crimes, and he recognized the deep-seated nature of Victoria's issues. Privilege is a powerful drug, Dr. Wilson explained to Victoria during one of their sessions. It creates a sense of entitlement that makes it almost impossible to see other people as fully human. Your attack on Jerome wasn't really about him at all. It was about your inability to accept a world where your assumptions about who belongs where might be wrong. As Jerome continued his studies and began planning for graduate school, he carried with him the knowledge that his experience had created ripple effects that would protect other travelers, inspire other students, and demonstrate to a watching world that dignity and education could triumph over hatred and ignorance. The healing process would continue for years, but the foundation of strength he had discovered in himself during those terrible moments in first class would serve him for the rest of his life. 2 years after Flight 447, Jerome Washington stood in a rural Alabama field, watching as crystal-clear water flowed from a pump that drew from the aquifer beneath Millerville's red clay soil. The water purification system he had designed in M.T's engineering lab was now providing clean drinking water to over 500 families in 3 counties. Families who had previously relied on contaminated wells or expensive bottled water that many couldn't afford. "Lord have mercy," said Mrs. Betty Johnson, Jerome's grandmother's neighbor, as she filled her pitcher with water that would have cost her $20 a week to buy in plastic bottles. "This boy done changed everything." Jerome smiled, remembering how this same technology, refined and improved through 2 years of real-world testing, had originally been dismissed as impossible by some of his professors who couldn't imagine that a student from rural Alabama might understand water problems better than academics who had never lived without municipal systems. The success of the Millerville pilot program had attracted attention from water justice organizations across the country, leading to contracts that would bring Jerome's systems to rural communities from Montana to Mississippi. The irony that Victoria's racist attack had provided the funding and visibility that made this expansion possible was not lost on anyone involved, least of all Jerome himself. His senior thesis, Decentralized Water Purification for Environmental Justice, had won every engineering award MIT offered. But more importantly, it had been published in the Journal of Environmental Engineering and was being cited by researchers around the world. The methodology Jerome had developed for low-cost, sustainable water treatment was being adapted for use in refugee camps, disaster relief operations, and developing countries where access to clean water remained a daily challenge. Dr. Angela Thompson, the environmental engineering professor who had become Jerome's mentor and research advisor, watched him demonstrate the filtration system to a group of visiting dignitaries with obvious pride. "What makes Jerome's work so remarkable," she explained to the delegation from the World Health Organization, "isn't just the technical innovation, though that's considerable. It's his understanding that technology should serve justice, that engineering can be a tool for leveling the playing field rather than maintaining existing inequalities." The recognition had been overwhelming. Jerome had been named to Time magazine's 30 Under 30 list of young innovators featured on the cover of Engineering Today and invited to speak at the World Economic Forum about the role of technology in addressing global inequality. But the moment that meant the most to him was when his grandmother Ruby cut the ribbon at Millerville's water treatment facility, tears streaming down her face as she realized that her grandson's education had come full circle to serve the community that had raised him. MIT had offered Jerome a full fellowship for graduate school, along with funding for a research lab that would focus on environmental justice engineering. His professors, who had once worried about whether a kid from rural Alabama could handle the academic rigor of their program, now competed to work with a student whose research was generating both scholarly attention and real-world impact. The personal growth that accompanied Jerome's professional success was equally remarkable. The shy young man who had once felt like an imposter in academic settings now spoke confidently to packed auditoriums about the intersection of technology and social justice. His experience on Flight 447 had taught him that his voice mattered, that his perspective as someone who had lived in communities that engineering often overlooked was not a limitation, but a strength. Dr. Chen had become not just a mentor, but a close family friend, attending Jerome's graduation and celebrating with Ruby and the extended Millerville community that had traveled to Boston to watch their son receive his degree. "You know," she told Jerome at the graduation party when I started live streaming that incident, "I thought I was documenting an injustice. I had no idea I was capturing the moment when a world changer found his voice." Captain Mackenzie, who had retired from Delta and was now working as a consultant on aviation safety and civil rights, served as the keynote speaker at Jerome's graduation. His speech focused on the theme of moral courage and the way that individual choices in moments of crisis could create lasting change. Jerome didn't choose to become a civil rights hero, Mackenzie told the assembled graduates and families. He chose to maintain his dignity and pursue his education. Sometimes, that's all it takes to change the world. The water purification systems were just the beginning of Jerome's vision for engineering social justice. His graduate research proposal outlined plans for developing affordable solar power systems, sustainable housing technologies, and agricultural innovations specifically designed for communities that had been overlooked by mainstream engineering. His approach combined rigorous technical analysis with deep community engagement, ensuring that the people who would use his technologies had input into their design and implementation. Victoria, meanwhile, had completed her court-mandated community service at a homeless shelter in Brooklyn, an experience that had slowly begun to crack the shell of entitlement that had defined her worldview for decades. Working alongside people whose life experiences were completely different from her own had been humbling in ways that her wealthy lifestyle had never allowed. She had written Jerome a letter of apology, though she never sent it, recognizing that her need for forgiveness was less important than his need to move forward without her presence in his life. The engineering department at MIT had established the Jerome Washington Institute for Environmental Justice, funded by donations inspired by his story and dedicated to developing technologies that addressed inequality rather than reinforcing it. Jerome would direct the institute after completing his PhD, creating a model for how engineering education could be oriented towards serving communities that had historically been excluded from technological advancement. As Jerome looked out over the Millerville field where children were playing near the water pump that had replaced a contaminated well, he thought about the trajectory that had brought him to this moment. Flight 447 had been a nightmare, a public humiliation that had exposed the persistence of racism in spaces where merit was supposed to matter most. But it had also been a revelation, a moment when he learned that his dignity and character could withstand any assault, that his education and innovation could serve purposes larger than personal advancement. The young man who had once worried about belonging in first class now understood that his real destination had always been the communities where his work could make the biggest difference. Victoria's attempt to diminish him had instead revealed the power of his potential, transforming a moment of hatred into a lifetime of service to the ideal that everyone deserved access to the basic necessities of life, regardless of their zip code or the color of their skin. The spring morning was perfect for the dedication ceremony, with Alabama sunshine filtering through the ancient oak trees that surrounded the new Millerville Community Innovation Center. Jerome Washington, now 26 and completing his PhD at MIT, stood before a crowd of over 500 people who had gathered to celebrate the opening of a facility that represented everything he had learned about the power of education, technology, and community to create lasting change. The center itself was a testament to sustainable engineering designed by Jerome and built with funding from the water purification systems that had made his name synonymous with environmental justice. Solar panels provided all the electricity, rainwater collection systems fed the landscaping, and the building materials had been sourced locally to support rural Alabama's economy. It was beautiful, functional, and proof that cutting-edge technology could serve communities that had historically been left behind by progress. 3 years ago, Jerome told the assembled crowd, his voice carrying easily across the field where he had played as a child. I thought success meant leaving this place behind and never looking back. I thought making something of myself meant forgetting where I came from and joining a world that I believed was better than the one that raised me. His grandmother Ruby sat in the front row, beaming with pride at the man her grandson had become. But that flight taught me something important. Jerome continued, his eyes finding Dr. Chen and Captain Mackenzie, who had flown in from their respective homes to attend the ceremony. It taught me that dignity isn't about the seat you're sitting in, or the clothes you're wearing, or the size of your bank account. Dignity is about knowing who you are and refusing to let anyone make you feel small for existing in spaces where you belong. The crowd included local families whose children would benefit from the center's STEM programs, professors from Auburn University who had partnered with Jerome on curriculum development, and representatives from technology companies who were eager to recruit students from the innovative educational programs the center would host. But it also included Victoria Ashford sitting quietly in the back row, nearly unrecognizable from the woman who had exploded into racist fury on Flight 447. Victoria's journey over the past 3 years had been one of painful self-examination and gradual awakening to realities she had spent her life ignoring. The court-mandated therapy had evolved into voluntary continued treatment as she began to understand the depth of the prejudices that had shaped her worldview. Her community service at the homeless shelter had introduced her to people whose humanity she had never considered, forcing her to confront the ways that privilege had blinded her to suffering and injustice. The financial consequences of her behavior had been devastating but ultimately liberating. The loss of her inherited wealth had forced her to find work first in customer service jobs that taught her humility, then eventually in a non-profit organization that focused on racial healing and reconciliation. The work was difficult and often triggering, but it was also the first genuinely meaningful purpose she had ever found. Dr. Michael Rivers, the organization's director and Victoria's supervisor, had been skeptical when she first applied to volunteer. "We don't usually work with people who became famous for racist behavior," he had told her bluntly. But Victoria's persistence, her willingness to do the most menial tasks, and her gradual demonstration of genuine change had eventually earned his cautious trust. The hardest part, Victoria had told Dr. Rivers during one of their supervision sessions, is understanding that I can never undo the harm I caused Jerome and everyone who witnessed what I did. I can change. I can grow. I can spend the rest of my life fighting against the kind of prejudice I once embodied, but I can never take back those words or repair the damage they did. Jerome's awareness of Victoria's presence at the ceremony was conscious and deliberate. His assistant had informed him that she had requested permission to attend, and after considerable thought and consultation with his therapist, he had agreed. Not because he forgave her exactly, but because his growth required facing all aspects of his story, including the person who had tried to destroy him. During the reception following the dedication, Victoria approached Jerome with obvious nervousness, her hands trembling as she waited for an opportunity to speak with him. "Mr. Washington," she said softly, "I don't expect you to forgive me, and I'm not here to ask for that. I just wanted you to know that what you've built here, what you've accomplished, proves everything I was wrong about that night." Jerome looked at her for a long moment, seeing not the entitled socialite who had tried to humiliate him, but a broken woman who was genuinely trying to become someone better. "Mrs. Ashford," he said finally, "I appreciate you coming, and I appreciate the work you're doing to change. But what I've built here isn't about proving you wrong. It's about proving something right, that education and opportunity can transform communities, that innovation can serve justice, that young people from places like Millerville have just as much potential as young people from anywhere else." The conversation was brief and civil, witnessed by Dr. Chen, who had positioned herself nearby in case Jerome needed support. Afterward, Victoria left quietly, understanding that her presence had been acknowledged, but that Jerome's forgiveness was not something she had earned or deserved. The interaction represented progress for both of them. Jerome's ability to face his former tormentor with calm dignity, and Victoria's acceptance that her redemption could not depend on absolution from the people she had harmed. Dr. Chen's documentary about the Flight 447 incident had won several awards and had been incorporated into diversity training programs across corporate America. Her follow-up project, focusing on Jerome's water purification work and its impact on rural communities, was currently in production and would premiere at the Sundance Film Festival. What's remarkable, she told the production team, is how Jerome has never let that incident define him. He took the worst moment of his life and used it as fuel for creating positive change. Captain Mackenzie had become a sought-after speaker on leadership and moral courage, using the Flight 447 incident as a case study in how individual choices in moments of crisis could create lasting impact. His retirement from Delta had been celebrated industry-wide with tributes from flight crews, passengers, and civil rights organizations who recognized his role in creating a more just and dignified travel experience for all passengers. The Innovation Center's first cohort of students included young people from across rural Alabama who showed promise in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. The program Jerome had designed combined rigorous academic instruction with hands-on problem-solving focused on challenges their communities actually faced: water quality, sustainable agriculture, renewable energy, and economic development. As the sun set over Millerville and the last of the ceremony attendees departed, Jerome walked through the center's laboratories and classrooms, imagining the discoveries and innovations that would emerge from this space. The building represented more than just educational opportunity. It represented the fulfillment of a promise he had made to himself during those terrible minutes on Flight 447, a promise that he would use his education not just for personal advancement, but for lifting up the community that had given him everything. Ruby Washington, now 78 and moving more slowly but still sharp as a tack, took her grandson's arm as they walked toward the parking lot. "Baby," she said, "your mama and daddy would be so proud of what you've done. Not just the awards and the recognition, but the way you came home and brought something beautiful with you." Jerome squeezed his grandmother's hand, understanding that this moment represented the completion of a circle that had begun with her sacrifices for his education and continued through the trials and triumphs that had shaped him into the man he had become. Flight 447 had been a test he never chose to take, but passing it had taught him everything he needed to know about character, dignity, and the power of education to create justice. The Lincoln Center screening room was packed with an audience that included civil rights leaders, education advocates, technology innovators, and ordinary citizens who had been inspired by Jerome Washington's story. Dr. Chen's new documentary, Beyond First Class: How Dignity Creates Change, was premiering as part of the New York Human Rights Film Festival 3 years after the incident that had first brought Jerome to national attention. The film was different from typical civil rights documentaries because it followed the story beyond the moment of confrontation, tracing the ripple effects that had emerged from Jerome's dignified response to Victoria's racist attack. Rather than focusing primarily on the trauma of discrimination, the documentary explored how individuals and institutions could transform moments of injustice into catalysts for broader social change. Jerome sat in the front row with his grandmother, Dr. Chen, and Captain Mackenzie, watching himself at age 23 speak with quiet determination about his right to occupy the seat he had earned. The filmmaker had obtained footage from multiple angles, including security cameras from the aircraft and several passenger phone recordings, creating a comprehensive record of what had actually occurred versus what Victoria had claimed. But the documentary's real power lay in its second and third acts, which followed Jerome's journey from victim to innovator to community leader. The film crew had spent months in Millerville documenting the water purification systems in operation, and interviewing families whose lives had been changed by access to clean drinking water. Children who had previously missed school due to waterborne illnesses were now thriving academically, and the economic benefits of eliminating expensive bottled water purchases had created measurable improvements in household stability. The documentary also included interviews with other passengers from Flight 447, exploring how witnessing the incident had affected their own understanding of racism and privilege. Many spoke about being forced to examine their own biases and assumptions, with several describing how Jerome's dignity had inspired them to speak up when they witnessed discrimination in their own lives. Victoria's transformation was handled with careful nuance, showing her current work with racial healing organizations without excusing or minimizing the harm her behavior had caused. The film included footage of her speaking at a conference about unconscious bias, acknowledging the prejudices that had driven her actions, and discussing the ongoing work required to change ingrained patterns of thinking. "I destroyed my life in 3 minutes on an airplane," Victoria said in her interview, her voice heavy with genuine remorse. "But I also learned that destruction can be the beginning of reconstruction if you're willing to do the hard work of examining who you really are and what you really believe about other people's humanity." The documentary's most powerful section focused on the institutional changes that had emerged from the Flight 447 incident. Airlines had implemented new training programs. Schools were using the story in their curricula, and corporate diversity initiatives had been strengthened by the clear demonstration of how quickly discriminatory behavior could become public and costly. Dr. Lisa Hernandez, a sociologist at Columbia University who studied viral social justice moments, provided academic context for the phenomenon. What made Jerome's story so powerful, she explained in her interview, was that it demonstrated the possibility of transformation at multiple levels: personal, institutional, and societal. Too often, these viral moments of injustice end with punishment, but not with meaningful change. This story showed a different path. The film's climax was the dedication of the Millerville Innovation Center, with Jerome's speech about dignity and belonging serving as the emotional crescendo. The footage of rural Alabama students working on advanced engineering projects while surrounded by the community that had raised them provided a visual representation of how individual excellence could serve collective advancement. As the credits rolled and the audience erupted in sustained applause, Jerome felt the strange sensation of watching his own life story told by someone else. The experience was simultaneously validating and surreal proof that the worst moment of his young adult life had somehow become a source of inspiration for strangers around the world. During the question and answer session that followed the screening, a young black woman in the audience asked Jerome how he had maintained his composure during Victoria's attack. "I think about my grandmother," he answered, looking toward Ruby, who was beaming with pride. "She taught me that other people's hatred says more about them than it does about you, and that the best response to someone trying to diminish you is to continue being excellent." A corporate diversity trainer asked about the practical applications of the story for workplace training. Dr. Chen fielded that question, explaining how the documentary was already being used in sensitivity training programs and how the combination of clear consequences for discriminatory behavior and positive recognition for moral courage had proven effective in changing organizational culture. Captain Mackenzie was asked about his decision-making process during the incident, and his response focused on the importance of leadership training that prioritized values over convenience. The easy thing would have been to move Jerome to economy class to keep the peace, he said. But easy isn't always right, and in positions of authority, we have a responsibility to use our power to protect people who are being targeted unjustly. The documentary had already been picked up by streaming services and would soon be available to audiences worldwide, continuing the conversation that had begun on Flight 447 and extending it to viewers who might never have otherwise considered their own roles as potential allies or bystanders in moments of discrimination. As the audience filed out of the screening room, many approached Jerome to share their own stories of discrimination or to thank him for his example of grace under pressure. A middle-aged white man told him, "I've been thinking about that flight for 3 years, wondering if I would have had the courage to speak up like some of those passengers did. Your story made me realize that I want to be the kind of person who stands up for what's right." A teenager from the Bronx who had attended with her social justice club told Jerome that his water purification work had inspired her to pursue environmental engineering. "I want to solve problems in my community the way you solved problems in yours," she said. And Jerome recognized the same determination he had felt at her age, the same belief that education could be a tool for creating positive change. The documentary premiere represented more than just the retelling of a story. It was proof that individual moments of courage could create lasting cultural shifts. Jerome's refusal to be intimidated, Captain Mackenzie's principled leadership, Dr. Chen's decision to document injustice, and even Victoria's eventual transformation had combined to create a narrative that would continue inspiring action long after the final credits rolled. The lecture hall at MIT was standing room only, filled with students whose faces reflected the diversity that the Institute had worked hard to achieve in recent years. Jerome Washington now. Dr. Jerome Washington, after successfully defending his PhD dissertation on environmental justice through sustainable technology. Innovation was returning to his alma mater as the featured speaker for the annual Engineering Ethics Symposium. At 26, Jerome carried himself with the confidence of someone who had been tested by fire and emerged stronger. His work had earned him recognition from the National Academy of Engineering. His water purification systems were operating in 12 states and 4 countries, and the Millerville Innovation Center had become a model for community-based STEM education that was being replicated across the rural South. 5 years ago, Jerome began looking out at an audience that included the current crop of first-year students struggling with imposter syndrome. "I sat in seats very much like yours, wondering if I belonged in this institution, wondering if someone from rural Alabama could possibly compete with classmates who had attended elite prep schools and had parents who were engineers themselves." The audience was captivated, many students leaning forward, as Jerome described his early days at MIT. The academic challenges, the financial pressures, the social navigation required to succeed in an environment where he often felt like an outsider. These were struggles that resonated deeply with many of the students in attendance, particularly those from underrepresented communities who saw their own experiences reflected in his words. "I thought success meant leaving my background behind." Jerome continued erasing the parts of myself that reminded the world where I came from, and assimilating completely into spaces that I believed were superior to the community that raised me. I was wrong about almost everything. He told them about Flight 447, not for the first time, but with a perspective that had deepened through years of reflection and growth. The incident that had once filled him with shame and anger was now a source of strength and wisdom. Proof that character was not determined by how you were treated, but by how you responded to treatment that was unjust. When that woman tried to remove me from first class, Jerome said she wasn't really attacking me personally. She was attacking the idea that someone who looked like me, who dressed like me, who came from where I came from, could possibly belong in spaces traditionally reserved for people like her. In responding to her attack, I wasn't just defending myself. I was defending every student in this room who has ever been made to feel like they didn't belong in spaces where their merit had earned them a place. The applause that followed was thunderous, but Jerome raised his hand to continue. "But here's what I learned from that experience, and this is the most important thing I want to share with you today. Excellence is not about escaping your community. Excellence is about returning to your community with tools that can make it stronger." He showed slides from the Millerville Innovation Center, the water purification systems providing clean drinking water to families who had been forgotten by larger infrastructure projects, the young people from rural Alabama who were now attending top engineering programs because they had been given opportunities to develop their potential. The woman who attacked me on that flight believed that success was a zero-sum game. Jerome explained that if someone like me succeeded, it somehow diminished her own achievements. But what we've proven in Millerville is exactly the opposite. When we create opportunities for people who have been overlooked, when we use our education to solve problems that affect real communities, when we expand the definition of who belongs in spaces of innovation and discovery, we make everyone stronger. In the audience, Professor Angela Thompson, who had mentored Jerome through his graduate work, felt tears in her eyes as she watched her former student inspire a new generation of engineers. The shy young man who had once worried about fitting in at MIT was now a commanding speaker whose vision of engineering as a tool for social justice was reshaping how the Institute thought about its mission and responsibilities. A student from Somalia raised her hand during the question period. Dr. Washington, how do you maintain hope when you face setbacks, or when people question whether you belong in spaces where you've earned your place? Jerome smiled, recognizing the universal nature of the question that transcended individual backgrounds. I think about my grandmother, he answered, who cleaned houses for 40 years to pay for my education. I think about the families in Millerville who now have clean drinking water because someone believed a kid from rural Alabama might have something valuable to contribute. And I remember that dignity is not something other people can give you or take away from you. Dignity is something you possess, and your job is to honor it by being excellent at what you do and generous with what you've learned. After the formal presentation, Jerome was surrounded by students who wanted to discuss research opportunities, share their own experiences with discrimination, or simply express gratitude for seeing someone who looked like them or came from similar backgrounds, succeeding at the highest levels of their field. A young woman from rural Mississippi told him about her work on sustainable agricultural systems. A first-generation college student from urban Detroit described his research on renewable energy infrastructure for low-income communities. A daughter of immigrants from El Salvador explained her interest in developing earthquake-resistant building techniques for developing countries. This is what I learned from that flight, Jerome told the gathered students as the evening wound down. When someone tries to make you feel small, the best response is not anger or resentment, though those feelings are natural and valid. The best response is to become so excellent at what you do, so committed to using your talents in service of justice and community that you make their prejudice irrelevant. Captain Mackenzie, who had been invited to attend the symposium, approached Jerome as the students began to disperse. Son, he said, your mother and father would be incredibly proud of the man you've become. What you've built with your life since that night proves that individual acts of courage can create ripple effects that change the world. Dr. Chen, who was documenting the symposium for a follow-up project about long-term impacts of viral social justice moments, captured the interaction between Jerome and the retiring captain who had stood up for him when it mattered most. Their relationship had evolved from protector and protected to colleagues and friends united by shared commitment to using their platforms to create a more just world. As Jerome walked across the MIT campus that evening, past the laboratories where he had conducted his research and the dormitories where he had struggled with feelings of inadequacy, he understood that his journey had come full circle in the best possible way. The institution that had once intimidated him was now a place where he belonged completely, not because he had abandoned his roots, but because he had learned to honor them through excellence and service. The students he had addressed that night would go on to develop their own innovations, serve their own communities, and face their own moments of testing. But they would do so with the knowledge that belonging was not about conforming to other people's expectations, but about bringing their full selves to spaces where their talents could flourish and their contributions could make the world more just and equitable for everyone. 7 years after Flight 447. The changes sparked by Jerome's dignified response to Victoria's racist attack had become woven into the fabric of American institutions. Airlines reported a 73% decrease in discrimination complaints, largely attributed to improved training programs and clear consequences for prejudicial behavior. The Jerome Washington Institute for Environmental Justice had trained over 200 engineers who were working on community-based solutions to infrastructure challenges across the rural South. Jerome's company, Dignity Water Systems, had provided clean drinking water to over 50,000 families, while creating jobs in communities that had been left behind by economic development. His marriage to Dr. Angela Thompson had produced not only personal happiness, but also groundbreaking research collaborations that were revolutionizing sustainable engineering practices. Victoria Ashford now. Victoria Hernandez, after remarrying and taking her husband's name, had become a respected voice in racial reconciliation work, though she never sought publicity for her transformation. Her quiet but consistent efforts to repair some of the harm caused by a lifetime of prejudice represented the possibility of genuine change, even for those whose hatred had once seemed irredeemable. The lesson endured dignity. Defended with courage, could transform not only individual lives, but entire systems, proving that sometimes the most powerful response to hatred was simply refusing to let it make you smaller than you were meant to be. Thank you for watching this story of courage, dignity, and transformation. If this tale of standing up for what's right inspired you, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories about ordinary people creating extraordinary change. Share this video with someone who needs to remember that their dignity is not negotiable and their dreams are worth defending. What would you have done in Jerome's position? Let us know in the comments below, and remember, excellence is the best response to prejudice, and education is the most powerful tool for justice.